Hello, I'm Amanda Thomas, and I'd like to welcome you to A Scientist Walks Into a Bar. This podcast features recordings of talks given at Science on Tap, a series of science lectures with beer held here in Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington. This episode is a recording of a talk given by Theodore Gray on his new book, Molecules, The Elements and the Architecture of Everything. Theo is a busy guy, and you may be familiar with him from one of his many projects, including being the co-founder of Wolfram Research, or his column in Popular Science called Gray Matter, where he set lots of things on fire. He's also founded an app development company called Touchpress, has won an Ig Nobel award, and is the author of several books, including The Elements and Mad Science. His latest book, Molecules, which is the subject of this episode, just came out in mid-October 2014. In this talk, he describes the inspiration for the book and some of the many molecules that are featured in it. He also talks about how the term chemicals is often misused in marketing to imply that something is bad or unsafe, but in reality, everything is made of chemicals. Finally, he gave a short demonstration of his new Molecules app that goes along with the book, and even though some of what he's talking about during that part was only visible on screen, I left it in this episode because the app is super cool and you should definitely check it out. The app is called Molecules by Theodore Gray, and it's available in the iTunes App Store. I've included both this talk and a couple of audience questions at the end that I thought were particularly fun. I've also synced the slides with this audio and uploaded this as an enhanced podcast, so depending on the app you're listening to, you may be able to see the slides as we go along. Here we go.
Yeah, so I kind of got started on this. I was actually in the software business, but we needed a new table for my office, and I was looking at catalogs of tables, and they're really expensive and ugly, and office supply catalogs are not very inspirational. And at the same time, I was reading this book called Uncle Tungsten by Oliver Sacks, which is a great book, and you should all read it. And he talks about what he referred to as a periodic table in the Science Museum in London. And I thought he meant a table that was shaped like a periodic table. And I thought that was just the most brilliant idea ever. And then I got to the next paragraph, and it turns out it's just on the wall, just like everybody else's periodic table. But since I kind of had tables in my mind, it kind of clicked that, I should make a periodic table, because as far as I could tell, nobody else had. So I made this thing. And we actually once tried to use it as a table to actually have a conference at, and somebody dropped a piece of silicon on their laptop and broke a key, and it was just downhill. So it's kind of decorative now. And so then I discovered eBay, and the thing has, you can see the little wooden tiles there. There's a compartment underneath each one of those wooden tiles where there's a space where I thought I could, maybe someday put an element in there. But with eBay, it's you just get everything, and there's all kinds of stuff you can get. And it just spiraled out of control. And so then it got so bad that Oliver Sacks actually came and visited my office to see this periodic table, which is totally his fault that I built it, because I feel that sentence was poorly worded that confused me into thinking. Anyway, so that was fun. And then I got this thing called the Ig Nobel Prize, which is he called me up ahead of time and asked if I would be embarrassed to receive it, because I guess the guy who awards these is nice enough to let people opt out if it would be damaging to their career. And I'm like, are you kidding? So for those of you who don't know, it's awarded for achievements that cannot or should not be replicated, or something like that. And that was a lot of fun. And so since this was, the area of people making crappy websites, I made a crappy website about this collecting hobby. And I decided if I don't photograph and write about each different little bit of element that I collect, I'll forget what they are. So I was kind of photographing, and I was putting these things on the website, little descriptions of what each sample of each element was. And I got this call from the Popular Science saying, would you like to write a column? Which I did for exactly 10 years until I eventually got too busy and flaked out on them so long that they fired me. Which I don't blame them, because I basically didn't write a column for 6 months because I was too busy. So that was great. It resulted in 2 books, which are basically the first 5 years and the second 5 years. And I improved my website and made it look a little better. And I published a poster with all these pictures. And then I ended up publishing a book. So this book, I found out over the summer, this now has 1 million copies in print, which just absolutely blows my mind. And I'm just really happy with that, and that's kind of probably why you invited me here. So what people reading the print book may not have realized is that at some point I started not just photographing each sample, but photographing that on a turntable around a complete circle, which I didn't really know why, and there wasn't like an application for it, but it just kind of seemed like it would be a fun thing to do. So I could do things like that because I actually had all these things photographed. And that turned out to be a great thing when the iPad came out, because I was able to turn the book into an iPad app where it was exactly the same as the book, except you can spin everything, which was kind of cool. And in the real thing, you actually spin it with your finger. It's not just a video. And it's got lots of stuff in it. And that did pretty well too, actually. And Apple liked it because I think Apple likes it because it's like a reason why parents should actually buy their kids this expensive toy. Angry Birds or whatever, it's not a good sales tool for why you ought to invest in a $500 device for your kids, but this is. Anyway, so that was kind of fun, and this led to me getting involved with app publishing because the Elements app was nice, and so I actually started a company called Touchpress, and we made a whole bunch of different apps, including Disney Animated, which is the reason that I stopped doing the Popular Science column, because writing that just took way too much time. So that's a brief history of how we got here, but I spent a lot of time working basically on other people's apps with Touchpress, but finally, a year and a half or so ago, I managed to actually get back to do my own project again, my own actual new next book, Molecules. And part of the reason it took so long to get around to this is trying to figure out how on earth do you write a book about all the molecules. I mean, because I kind of set this precedent of writing a book about all the elements. That's easy enough. There's like a list of them, and you write something about each one. But in the case of molecules, it's I think it's 35 million roughly that have a sort of official names in databases. You can't possibly cover them all. You can't even cover all the categories. And I finally realized that this just gives me license to write about only the ones that I think are interesting, because it's completely hopeless to be comprehensive. So I'm just going to kind of tell you about some of the things that I think are interesting to do with molecules. And we're going to start with this video of my girlfriend, because she's my girlfriend, and because this is illustrating the fundamental force of nature that holds all molecules together, namely the electrostatic force. And also because it's sort of an introduction to the first thing I'm telling you about, which is thread. I spent a lot of time with sort of thread and quilting related projects. So this is cotton. It's like this is an actual cotton plant. It's the where you get cotton from. And the fibers in this plant are very short. They're about like an inch long. This is a spool. It's 6,000 yards of triple ply cotton thread. It's huge, 3 miles of thread. And all the fibers in it are still only about an inch long. Like, they're not glued together or anything like that. They're just, the only thing that holds them together is the twist of the thread. And if you untwist it carefully, you can actually, the thing will just come apart, and you're not breaking any sort of fibers. You're just sort of pulling it apart. And it turns out this is actually an excellent analogy for how a lot of polymers work. Normally, when you have sort of a physical intuition about the world of the atomic scale, you're wrong, because it's quantum mechanics and it's all weird. But in the case of polymers, this is polyethylene, sort of a schematic diagram of a tiny bit of polyethylene. It actually is held together simply by the fact that if you have very long chains of atoms together, even if they can slide a little bit next to each other, they kind of tangle and they end up twisted up. And you can actually feel this very directly with a wonderful little demonstration. This is an ordinary plastic grocery bag. And here, like, you can tear it. And what's happening here is there aren't very many molecules breaking here. They're basically just being separated from each other because they're all kind of randomly oriented and they're not very lined up. But if you pull it this way instead, where you kind of pull it out a certain distance, many of you probably experienced this, if you're trying to tear it, at some point it's like it stops and it becomes much stronger and it'll like cut your finger trying to tear it. It becomes like a piece of fiber. That's the point at which the molecules have been stretched out and are now sort of more or less lined up with each other and are trying to slide past each other. And the strength that you feel is the strength of the carbon-carbon backbone down those polyethylene molecules. And that's a very, very strong bond. And I think it's really quite remarkable that you can, in this very simple way, feel directly a force which is attributable, is traceable right back down to the carbon-carbon backbone in that molecule. Grocery bags are made out of relatively low molecular weight polyethylene, which means the chains are a few thousand atoms long. And they're therefore not all that strong because they're able to slide around and work their way past each other. This is an example of a UHMW, ultra high molecular weight polyethylene. That gets up to like 500,000 atoms long, which is still only a tiny fraction of a millimeter, but this stuff is much stronger. In fact, some of the strongest fibers known are just very, very long chain polyethylene. But it has to be very, very long chain because polyethylene, these are kind of slippery molecules and they kind of slide. So one question is there whereas cotton fibers, the surface of the fiber is quite rough. So the question, is there an equivalent of roughness in molecules? And the answer is yes. So something like Kevlar, for example, the Kevlar polymer molecule has a lot of benzene rings in it. And when they layer up against each other, they tend to stick. And so Kevlar is actually much stronger even with shorter molecular weight chains. And you can even go a step farther. You can do the molecular equivalent of gluing the fibers together. So this is a picture of cross-linked natural rubber, latex rubber. And the way that, it starts out as an ordinary polymer, but you heat it with sulfur, hence the term vulcanization, because anything involving sulfur smells really bad and reminds people of volcanoes. They actually link together. And I think it's a statistical near certainty that, for example, that shoe is a single molecule that happens to be shaped like a shoe. Because the amount of cross-linking and the length of the chains means that you've almost certainly connected the whole thing up together into one molecule. So anyway, back to the cotton. So cotton, the molecule in cotton is cellulose. And so these are just some examples of different kinds of cellulose items. And you notice that like all polymers, or most polymers, it's a series of repeating identical units. The question is, what's the unit in cellulose? And the answer is it's sugar. It's glucose sugar. And so why isn't it sweet? Like and the reason is because the way that the glucose molecules are linked to each other is at a particular position in the molecule where we don't have any sort of an enzyme in our stomach that's able to digest, that's able to break that bond. So it stays linked together and it doesn't taste sweet, and we can't get any nutritional value from it. The only creatures that are able to digest this are certain bacteria which have a symbiotic relationship with animals that can eat grass, like cattle. And so if you want to extract the sugar energy from cellulose, you have to engage in a chemical processing, a process called cattle ranching. And you feed it to them, and they know how to digest it, and then you eat the cows. So here's an example. So on the left, I think it's your left. Yes, also your left. Interesting how that works. And the left is cotton, which is made of glucose, 100% glucose, but you can't eat it. On the right is cotton candy, which is actually only 50% glucose because table sugar is glucose plus fructose. So there's actually more sugar, there's more glucose sugar in the cotton than in the cotton candy. So cellulose is an example of something made of sugar, but it's not sweet. There's also things which are sweet, but not made of sugar. So this is this is a sugar dip bowl on the bottom. The top is a saccharin bowl, which is very small because saccharin is incredibly intensely sweet. And so you don't need much of it. And you can actually, there's things that are actually much sweeter than that. So this is 100 pounds of sugar. And if I had my notes, I would tell you, I think I remember it's 170,000 calories and 14,000% of your daily carbs or something like that. So like this is a lot of sugar. But if you look, there's a tiny little dish balanced on top of that, which we can zoom in on. So this is 4.5 grams of neotame, which is the sweetest substance known, basically. It's 10,000 times sweeter than sugar. I got a bag of this stuff from eBay, of course. And it came in a little pouch, and I was going to measure it out to take this picture. And I opened the pouch, and like immediately, before I just opened the pouch and tasted sweet in the back of my throat. Like somehow this completely invisible quantity it's a very fine powder, it kind of wafted up. And literally the next morning, I was still licking sweetness off my mustache. And I tried to be reasonably careful with the stuff. It's unbelievably sweet. And people complain about artificial sweeteners and think they're unhealthy and all that. But so I did the math. So the most toxic synthetic compound known is VX nerve agent. And if neotame were as toxic as VX nerve agent, you would actually still have a pretty good chance of surviving a cup of coffee that had been sweetened with an appropriate quantity of it. Simply because the amount needed to sweeten the coffee is so fantastically small. Not that I would recommend eating that amount of VX, but anyway, so there's lots of different artificial sweeteners, and some of them are synthetic. Neotame, as it happens, is a sort of a derivative of aspartame. Two of these things here are synthetic chemicals, the ace-butane potassium and sucralose, and two of them are natural, the steviocyte and malgroside. All four of these are commercially available. They're all very intense sweeteners. And one question that people sort of debate, or maybe don't debate as much as they should, is, does it matter whether it's natural or artificial? Is stevia better for you or safer because it's natural? I think this is actually kind of the wrong question. So here's a package of Sweetenlow. It's sweetened with saccharin. And something you may not know about Sweetenlow is that it's actually 94% pure glucose sugar in that packet. Now, you may wonder, how is this possible? It says 0 calorie on it in capital letters. And the answer is that there's an FDA regulation that says that if the number of calories in an item is less than 5 calories, you can round it down to 0. So it may not be a surprise to you, there's 4 calories worth of sugar in there. And if you read the ingredients, it's like dextrose or something, which is a literal synonym for L-glucose. And so I'm slightly diabetic. And my take on this is I am absolutely outraged. I think it's scandalous that the dangerous, unhealthy, natural substance sugar is allowed to contaminate what should be a clean, pure, synthetic saccharin. Because I don't want the sugar. It's bad for me. I want the artificial thing. And by the way, for those of you of a certain age who remember the saccharin warning labels, it kind of freaked me out actually when I realized that much later that Sweetenlow is saccharin and there's no warning label on it. And I wondered how is that possible? Because it used to always say you're going to die if you eat this stuff. And the reason is because people actually eventually figured out, not only decided that the stuff was safe, but figured out why people were wrong about it in the first place. And it's an interesting little story about what the sort of misleading indications were that caused people to think that saccharin was actually bad for you. So much so that it was taken off the famous California list of chemicals known to the state of California to cause signs on the side of buildings or something like that. Yeah, that's just another slide of the same thing. Oh, and so here's another interesting fact. If you buy Sweet and Low in Canada, it's not sweetened with saccharin because saccharin is still banned in Canada. Instead, it's sweetened with cyclamate. And cyclamate is still banned in the US, but is legal almost everywhere. So like our Sweet and Lows are mutually exclusively illegal. And in most of Europe, they're actually both permitted. And so most of that sort of genre of artificial sweeteners in Europe is a mixture of both saccharin and cyclamate, because apparently that tastes better. So sometimes I start to sound like a shill for the chemical industry, because I actually like molecules, and I like chemicals, but I don't want to kind of imply that there's no such thing as dangerous synthetic chemicals. This is an example. So lead acetate was used as an artificial sweeteners, most recently by the Romans. It didn't go well for them. It was a really bad idea. I mean, it's lead acetate. It's lead. Lead is really bad for you. What you may not realize is that certain progressive hair dye formulas, which I don't have any need for them, but I was looking into it for a friend, and it turns out the pigment is lead acetate. And when it's darkening your hair, it's actually accumulation of lead in your hair that's causing it to darken, which is like, I find that inconceivable that would be legal, and certainly not a good idea. Just because it's a chemical doesn't mean it's good for you. And I personally draw the line at coloring my hair with lead. But I do that because lead is toxic, not because it's an artificial substance. So for example, this is black licorice. And the principal sort of flavor ingredient in black licorice is glycyrrhizin, which happens to be also very, very sweet. And it also happens to be quite toxic. So much so that, like, if it were a synthetic chemical, if it were an artificial food ingredient, there's absolutely no way it would ever have been approved, or had it been, it would have been withdrawn. It's known to be quite toxic, and in fact, you can, if you eat very large but not completely implausible amounts of black licorice over a period of many months, you can actually cause kidney damage. But there's absolutely no regulation about that. It's completely unregulated, and there's even licorice that advertises how strong its flavor is, which is to say that it has a lot of this toxin in it. So what I'm getting at is I think that the whole natural versus synthetic, it's the wrong question. So here's an example of a natural substance. This is coca leaf. I happened just randomly to run into two friends of mine when I was working on this book, one of whom had a coca leaf tea that they'd gotten in Peru, and the other one who'd just been in Peru and brought back some dried coca leaf. So I had this amazing opportunity to photograph this stuff. You may have guessed this is coca leaf, and what's in it is cocaine. In Peru, this is considered a perfectly normal thing. Like I say, you buy the tea in the tourist shop, and it causes nobody any real trouble down there. But in fact, in this country, all over the world, for generations, it was considered a really good thing. It was the first effective dental anesthetic, and was really, really good from the point of view of solving people's toothache problems, and was sold over the counter and was in Coca-Cola and all that. And in fact, amusingly so, it turns out that drug addicts who have limited access to medical care are frequently aware of the fact, and they also frequently have tooth problems. They're aware of the fact, so if you rub powder cocaine on your gums, it's like better pain management than most people who go to their doctor will get, because the doctor is not allowed to prescribe cocaine, and it's actually still one of the most effective topical anesthetics. The problem, of course, is that you can turn it into crack cocaine, and in that form, it's tremendously destructive, and it tears apart entire neighborhoods. This is how you cook crack cocaine, which turns out to be a fairly straightforward I mean, I don't know. I get a certain amount of flack for talking about this kind of thing in audiences that have kids, but I really feel like one should not shy away from the reality of what this is. It's a chemical reaction, and it's molecules being transformed into each other, and some of them are fine, and some of them are okay depending on how you treat them, and some of them are just really a bad idea. This being one of them. But again, so here's two substances here. So one on the left is crack cocaine. The one on the right is heroin. Heroin is synthetic. Crack cocaine is a natural plant extract. And I think in debate about which of these is like the better drug or the worst drug or whatever, of all the possible things that you could argue about the relative merits of these two things, the fact that one is synthetic and the other is natural is like the least interesting possible thing you could say about it. And yet, that's very often the debate that is had in public discourse about chemicals is this an artificial chemical? It must be bad. So here's an example of azodicarbamide. It was recently, like Subway restaurants, they announced that they're taking it out of their bread because there was a fairly effective campaign by a food blogger. And basically the argument there was, this stuff is used to make yoga mats. It must be terrible. It's a synthetic chemical that's used to make rubber mats. How can you put this in your bread? My counter argument to this is I really love lye bread. That's a lye roll down there. When I was growing up as a kid, we had these and they were great, and I still like them. And they're made with lye, and lye, sodium hydroxide, is an incredibly terrible thing. I mean, it's a drain opener, basically. It's what if you're a drug dealer and you have some bodies you want to get rid of, you dissolve it with lye. And yet it's crucial to the making of lye bread, which is really good. And the fact, it's like not a sensible argument. What you ought to be looking at what the chemicals actually are, not kind of where they came from. And the fact is that, everybody loves chemicals. Everybody, no matter what they say about it, loves chemicals. So, for example, if you like asparagus, these are the chemicals that you particularly enjoy the taste of. I could give you a similar list for apples or whatever. So here's a picture from my book. Name your food, and if you have a good enough laboratory, you can figure out which chemicals it is that you like. Which isn't to say that there aren't toxic chemicals. Some of those toxic chemicals are natural, some of them are synthetic. The fact of the matter actually is that of the four most toxic chemicals known, the top three by a wide margin are natural. There's botulinum toxin, there's metatoxin, which comes from a marine snail, and this one that I never know how to pronounce, the poison dart frog poison. And then many hundreds of times less toxic is the most toxic known synthetic chemical, which is VX. And the reason for this is that, for the most part, is that plants they can't move. The only defense they have is chemical. So they engage in a lot of chemical warfare in things like asparagus and apples or whatever. They have a lot of fungicides and insecticides in them. Not that we put there, but that the plant put there in order to try to defend itself. And they aren't harmful to us, not because they aren't toxic, because many of them are very toxic. They're not harmful because they're present in incredibly small quantities. And they're dangerous to the animals that are trying to eat the thing, or the fungus or bacteria, whatever that's trying to grow in there. This is a project that I was involved with Touchpress about false convictions and exonerations and things like that. And there's a couple of interesting lessons that one learns from this. One of them is that is the value of DNA as an amazing sort of laser beam of truth that goes back into decades old murder cases and discovers that this guy that's been locked up actually is completely innocent. There was a really interesting study that I mentioned in the book where they did basically the same thing to herbal supplements. Where they used DNA fingerprinting to examine the contents of 40 or 50 sort of popular brands of herbal supplements purchased all over the country. And they found that 30% of them actually had none of any of the listed ingredients in them. 60% had something wrong in there, but 30%, the figure that blows my mind is 30% had nothing, absolutely nothing of any of what was listed there. And every time I quote that statistic, I finally put this reference up there because I still can't believe it's true. Sort of what you learn from looking at false convictions is that there's kind of two things that go wrong with locking up the wrong person. One is you've locked up the wrong person, which is just a great injustice. But the other is that you haven't locked up the right person. And that person may well go on, and in fact, statistically speaking, often does go on to commit other crimes. And the same thing really applies when you kind of attack the wrong cause, the wrong chemical, or the wrong substance. So an example of that is algae blooms in lakes. So everyone has heard it's phosphates in detergents causes algae blooms in lakes, and this is terrible. And that may actually be true in some cases, but there's also pretty strong indication that in many cases the algae blooms are actually not caused by the phosphate. They're actually caused by other pollution that has killed off the plankton that eat the algae. And a great deal of effort that's been put into limiting phosphates in detergents might actually have been a complete mistake, not so much, it's basically just targeting the wrong place, and so that means there's other, harmful things that have been going on that were not targeted and that were sort of ignored. And it's only by, sort of finding the real cause of the problem without prejudice and without sort of jumping to conclusions that, well, it must be this particular chemical that we don't like that's causing the problem. Okay. Yes. So that's sort of my plea for not being prejudiced against molecules just because they come from a bad background, like they're synthetic as opposed to natural. I think one ought to judge them on the content of their character, not the whatever. Because really bad decisions are made when you make decisions based on not what something actually is, but where it comes from. And anyway, well, I apologize for being so polemic about that. And to make up for it, I have the funniest thing I know about vanilla. The question is, how do you tell the difference between natural and synthetic vanilla? Because it's a problem that natural vanilla is very, very expensive. You have to farm it, and people have to pollinate it by hand. And there's a problem with companies fraudulently substituting synthetic vanilla for the natural product and selling it as natural at a much higher price, which you can't detect because it's chemically identical. It's like exactly the same chemical, and so there's no way to determine whether it was synthetic or not. Except it turns out there is a way to tell. So if you remember carbon-14 dating, you may be familiar with. The way the carbon-14 dating works is that when plants grow, they incorporate radioactive carbon from the air, which then decays very slowly. Synthetic vanilla is made from petroleum feedstocks. Petroleum is plants, but very, very old plants. So it's actually not radioactive, whereas natural vanilla comes from fresh plants and is therefore radioactive. So they actually do this. This is how vanilla fraud is detected, is that the natural stuff is radioactive, whereas the synthetic stuff is not. And that's the only difference. So there you go. So I'm now going to try to give you a little demo of the Molecules app. So it's basically the same as the Elements book and app, and in Molecule app you have it's got these what I refer to as still life video, which is basically like this. So the idea is to kind of show off the different properties of substances. Anyway, so this is aniline. Not aniline. It's indigo. Indigo is the blue of blue jeans. And like many of the molecules that you see both in this book and elsewhere, you see there's these sort of two-dimensional renderings of molecules. This is not what molecules are like. And the only reason that they're this way in the book and everywhere else is because on paper things are flat, and you kind of have to flatten them out and show them in this kind of schematic way. What molecules are actually like is this. they're very three-dimensional things. And not only that, they're very active, dynamic three-dimensional things. So one thing you'll be able to do in this app, which actually nobody has ever been able to do before, not even the people who developed this software over decades, and it's a very fancy piece of molecular dynamics software, is you can actually touch these things and drag them around. Excellent. It's exactly the response I was hoping for. So this is like a for real molecular dynamics simulation. It's not kind of a game. It's not a toy type simulation. It's the real deal with quantum mechanics and everything. Let me show you. I want to go back to the indigo because that has a particular property that is cool. To go back here, all the way back. Oh, actually, this one's kind of fun. So this is aniline, and it actually starts out kind of bad. So one thing that I as soon as we got this software kind of working, that I had fun with was spinning. Usually it's methyl groups. This is an amine group, but you can pick these up and you can spin it like that. And you see how it's like it notches in. It likes to stay in a certain position. This is all like real. This is what the quantum mechanics is saying that these molecules would do if you were to be able to pick them up and mess with them. So we'll go back to aniline. So here's aniline. So the thing about aniline, or not aniline, I keep saying that, it's indigo. The thing about indigo is that its color comes, you see how it's flat? Its color comes from conjugation across these three double bonds. When they're all in a plane, the electrons are able to sort of delocalize across those bonds, and that allows relatively small energy gaps that absorb light. And it only works when it's flat. And the question is, how hard is it to get this thing out of the plane? And I need both hands to do this. It turns out you can do that if you pick up. I'm going to put two fingers down here, and I'm going to take my third finger and flip it like that. And okay, yeah, see, there you go. Now I've flipped it. So it's now, instead of having two hydrogen bonds across the oxygen instead we've got it the wrong way. And I don't think it would be colored anymore. I'm not sure, though. But in any case, it's the wrong way. But it's stable because this double bond here is still has enough resistance to rotation to keep it stable. And you can see the two hydrogens they kind of don't want to be with each other. We can turn this into space filling mode, and you kind of see they're kind of fitting. And so then the question is, how do you get it? Can you get it back again? It's actually quite easier to get it back just by flicking it. But the other way to do it is to heat it. So if I heat up the simulation temperature, at some point, the higher you go, the faster. Eventually, I'm going to go to ridiculous temperature. At this point, the thing would have long ago, burned up. But just to speed up the process here, if we watch it, it's going to flip. It's going to flip. Okay, there, I think it flipped. Okay, all right, now we can cool it back down again. Okay, so now it's back where it is. Right, so basically what this lets you do is it lets you have kind of your fingers on the molecule and get a physical intuition for what these things are really like. And like I say, nobody's ever hooked up this molecular dynamics engine like this to a touch screen where you can put multiple fingers on things and kind of move these things around like that. And I think it's going to be really cool. Unfortunately, you can't get it yet. So, but in the meantime, let me turn this off. Oh, okay. In the meantime, the print book is really cool, and. Seriously, it's actually better than what. People sometimes ask me, should I get the app, should I get the print book? And there's really only one answer, which is you have to get both, because the print book it's beautiful and it's big and you can put it on your coffee table, and the app has the wiggling molecules. Anyway, so that's what I had to say, and I think we're going to take questions now.
Over here in the back.
In the first parts of your book, you talk a bit about chemistry sets and how it's difficult to get them, or the modern chemistry set is not what it used to be. So kind of combining old and new, is is your company thinking about perhaps a app version of a chemistry set?
So when I first started writing the Elements book, I kind of, even before it was half finished, I thought, there's 3 books here that there ought to be. There's elements, you put them together to make molecules, and then you make the molecules react with each other. So, elements, molecules, reactions. Reactions will be out in 2016 for Christmas, 2 years from now. If I actually write it, I signed a deal to do it, but, powers that be permitting, there'll be an app to go with reactions, and what I have in mind, budget permitting, will be extremely cool. But that's a long ways off still. And I have mixed feelings about it, because I think that a virtual chemistry set where you can mix things together and make them react, being able to do that at the molecular level, where you're like putting together molecules and have that be real, that will be very cool. But doing it with actual chemicals on an actual table, that's pretty important too. And it's not a substitute. One is not an alternative to the other. I think the virtual thing can greatly enrich people's experience, and particularly at molecular level simulation of reactions is something that will be cool, and that is sort of at the edge of what's possible now. But again, it's no substitute for the real thing, and people ought to go out there and mix up chemicals and make smoke, and I had all the stuff I was going to do for you guys here, but it turns out they have carpet and didn't want to kill everybody. So yeah.
Well, don't you mention in the book something about being able to get real chemistry sets on eBay? Yeah,
so that's an interesting phenomenon that at the same time as it's gotten harder to get some of these stuff through big box stores or whatever, the amount of stuff you can get on eBay is kind of scary, actually. And I think a middle ground might be nice. But the fact is that on the internet, in general, and eBay in particular, you can just get absolutely anything you want, including stuff that you really shouldn't be getting, and that can be quite dangerous, actually. Beyond the normal level of danger that I'm in favor of.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about the whole organic food and organicness of using in marketing and advertising, and you got in that a little bit in the book. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I don't know. It's people. The word organic is so debased now. Of course, first of all, it has a well-defined meaning as organic chemicals means something in particular as compared to inorganic chemicals. But that's generally not the way that the word is used. For example, I have an example in the book of organic salt, which, salt is kind of one of the prototypical inorganic chemicals. But the word instead is used as to sort of mean good or healthy or something like that, which isn't really, it's just not a very useful definition of the word. And it's used, the minerals or the herbal supplements pill is kind of an example of that. It's a term that you can hide behind if you wish to defraud the public. And anytime you have a term that sort of encourages credulity and encourages people to think that, oh, it must be okay, we don't have to look too closely because it's, there's nice people and it's, family farmers or whatever. You look a little closer, actually, it's a company based in New Jersey somewhere that's raking leaves up in the backyard and packaging them in capsules. Just because something is called organic and healthy and all natural doesn't actually mean that it is. And the fact that there's virtually no oversight and no regulation means that you're actually quite a bit, considerably more risk with that kind of stuff than with these kind of nasty synthetic things that actually have a certain degree, although minimal, of government regulation and oversight. It's quite minimal, but at least it's a little bit. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not exactly sure, where the right balance is, because chemicals. I guess the basic problem that I have is that the word organic and the word chemical are permitted to be used in commerce in ways that I think are very deceptive. I mean, the FDA, or the FTC, I mean, actually has a specific ruling that essentially allows people to use the word chemical as a synonym for harmful or artificial. So it's like I have a package of dye that I brought, it's indigo dye. It says in big capital letters, no chemicals. And it's like it's indigo dye. It's all about chemicals. In fact, it's one of the most important chemicals in the history of chemistry because it was the synthesis of indigo and related mauveine and fuchsine. The synthesis, the development of those as synthetic alternatives to the natural was what got the organic chemistry industry started in Germany, and is the reason why Germany is still kind of a powerhouse in chemicals. And when you use indigo dye, what you get in a package is actually green. It's indigo glycoside that is in the plant. You heat it. It undergoes a chemical reaction to become the chemical indocin, which is white, or transparent. It's then oxidized in the air, which is another chemical reaction to the chemical indigo. And yet it's perfectly legal. It's not, it's legal to say no chemicals on it because you can use the word chemical to mean no, ugly, harmful, bad, made by rapacious chemical companies sort of chemicals, which is just not helpful to sort of public appreciation of issues of interest that, in fact, it's all chemicals. Everything is made of chemicals. All the food you're eating is made of chemicals, and you really ought to be paying attention to what those chemicals are, not to sort of slogans about where they came from, or people claiming that they're good for you because of something or other that has nothing to do with what's actually in the stuff.
Back over here.
In acquiring your samples and eBay and things like that, have you ever had anybody show up at your door wanting to know about your reasonings for these purchases?
Well,
dark
yeah,
suits and
actually,
sunglasses?
yes. So, well, there's a number of things that I've gotten that have been questionable, I guess. You saw videos of some of them, but that was a long time ago, and it's not there anymore. You won't find it. But actually, the best example by far of that was in the Elements, where I got this niobium alloy rocket nozzle. So it was from a steering thruster from a Minuteman II nuclear missile. And it was on eBay, and I thought Minuteman II. I remember when I was growing up, people were, debating Minuteman, and, I figured this is all, ancient history, and there's some kind of military surplus, and it's this little thing that had a cool niobium nozzle. And then, like a year later or so, I got this phone call from the FBI that said, "We would like to come to your office and take your nozzle away." Because it turned out that they're still there, like those missiles are still there, and that was not military surplus, that was stolen. And so the interesting thing about this, if they had called a week earlier, the front desk at my company would have told them that, sorry, he's in China. And it might have been a different conversation, because that was right about the time where there was some controversy with a Chinese scientist who was accused of espionage. And anyway, as it happens, these two nice agents showed up, and they talked to me for a little while and said, "We're going to have to take your nozzle away." And I said, "That's fine. I've photographed it. It'll make a great story." And they said, and by the way, don't worry, we have a file on you, and you're fine. We all read your column, and we know who you are. Apparently I wasn't actually in a lot of trouble. They just, they had to go out and collect all of this stuff. This guy had listed, he'd been selling this stuff on eBay for a while. There's lots of these parts that he apparently had stolen from an Air Force base somewhere. But so far, that's the only actual contact with law enforcement.
Well, and following up on that, are there elements or molecules that you've been unable to, other than, francium and things like that, but that are illegal that you can't get?
So in the world of elements, there's the most frustrating one probably is technetium, element 43, which is, there is a long-lived isotope of technetium that you could in principle have a bunch of, and it would even be legal, but it's just I've never been able to find any place. It's not something that, if you have to make it, it's synthetic. They have to make it, and there's no real reason for anybody to make it. And so I just have been unable to get any appreciable quantity of technetium. I think in the case of molecules, yeah, there's millions and millions and millions of them, and many of them are illegal. There aren't many illegal elements other than plutonium. But there's lots and lots of illegal molecules. And I don't know, there's a lot of fun things. Like I just learned a really fascinating fact recently and was able to acquire it for only $40. I was very happy. So it turns out, remember when cigarettes were healthy? And then at some point it was decided that they're actually really bad for you and that you ought to have filters, that there should be filters on cigarettes. And so you want to guess what they made the first filters out of? Asbestos filters. So some of you probably saw that same place I did. But so I immediately went to eBay and managed to get an Air Force One commemorative Kent micronite filter cigarette pack for $40. And I was like, wow, what a steal. And it's like, smoking with an asbestos filter on an airplane. That's like some real 1950s flavor there.
Hello, I was just wondering what experiment were you planning to do today? You can't because of the fire hazard.
Oh, well, I had a couple. Actually, I have video of a few that I was going to do. Let's see if we can skip. Right. So one of the things I did, so I have a chapter on fibers, and so I wanted to get silk as an example of like a great fiber. And I ordered this stuff on eBay. I have several different kinds of silk from eBay, but it's eBay, so I didn't want to put something in the book that I didn't know for a fact was actually silk. And so I looked up how does one tell, and it turns out that like the feel, even experts have trouble determining the difference between genuine silk and a high quality synthetic just by the look or the feel of it. They're actually very, very good imitations. But there's one absolutely surefire way, which is by burning it. So when you burn silk, it's a lot like burning hair. It melts a little bit, but it kind of it kind of chars more so than burning. And it burns and it bubbles a little bit, but basically you end up with a black char and it smells terrible, just like burning hair. And whereas if you burn the synthetics like nylon or polyester or anything like that, they kind of melt, and it's very characteristic. They kind of send down flaming balls of molten plastic that make this funny sound as they're dripping down. And it's totally unambiguous. And apparently this is actually like if you go to China or something and you're a buyer and you're testing for whether it's genuine silk, it's apparently an accepted thing that you pull a thread out and burn it, because that's how you can tell. And you apparently have to watch out, according to what I read, that the merchants will sometimes try to pull a thread out of the label because only the label is actually silk, and you have to watch out. Anyway, so I had brought a bunch of this stuff, but instead we have here videos of, so the reference samples, the top two are two different kinds of silk, which actually both turned out to be genuine, and the bottom two are synthetics. But yeah, and you can see it's kind of dripping fire. So yeah, that was one thing, just useful practical advice of how to not get ripped off with fake silk. And then related to that, so in the chapter on fibers, having tried this, I thought, well, let's burn some other fibers. Some like Kevlar, for example, doesn't burn at all. It's amazing. Just hold up there. Fiberglass obviously doesn't burn. It turns out steel wool actually burns in a very beautiful way. And I have like my whole suitcase half full of steel wool because I was going to set up a giant wall of steel wool to light. It's surprising, and it's entirely a surface area phenomenon. I mean, this is the same material that a frying pan is made out of. And the only difference is that there's a lot more surface area to volume in a very fine, this is like 4 zeros, very fine steel wool. And if you could get a frying pan that hot, it would actually also catch fire. As long as you were feeding it oxygen at a high enough rate. So that was another demo that I didn't get to do. And then this one actually perhaps could have. So I was going to show you these two things. This is what the eBay seller said about the material. It's 100% natural. It comes from plants. This is a picture of the stuff. This is the MSDS sheet from Sigma, I think. And then I was going to see who would take some, and hold it and smell it. So it turns out that the substance is menthol, and it's actually let me get that to turn again. It's really cool. I mean, it looks like quartz crystals, but you pick it up and it smells like the strongest cough drops you've ever seen, and it's literally pure crystal and menthol, which you can buy on eBay by the pound for not much. And then sugar. So it turns out I was going to tell you about the energy content of sugar and how you can get that by eating it. But you can also, if you have powdered sugar, very fine confectioner's sugar, and put it in a little plastic squeeze bottle, and blow puffs of it over a candle flame, you can get like 5-foot tongues of fire. Just boom. Outside is a fine place to do it, yeah. And I was going to show you another way of making a flamethrower, but we won't get into that. Sugar is amazingly a high energy material. But
sorry.
Was not to be.
Sorry we couldn't do that, but you guys can all do that at home later, right? Actually, I had a question from one of the minions, and we tried this and it didn't work. Shaving cream is supposedly made of butane and and propane, and it doesn't burn.
Shaving cream?
Yeah. Do you any?
I've never actually tried burning shaving cream.
We did.
And it doesn't burn? Okay, I'll just show you this very quickly. Kids don't watch. Okay. As mentioned, so I have the last chapter of my book that's about molecules that really, really annoy people, and the sort of different reasons. And one of the things in there is chlorofluorocarbons, which annoy people because they destroy the ozone, and because there was some very, very bad behavior on the part of certain chemical companies in connection with them. And actually, recently, I just, you may have read that apparently the ozone hole is actually getting smaller now, and it's regulation and removal of that substance from many places has actually apparently had an actual good effect on the atmosphere, which is kind of amazing. But one of the effects of banning that from aerosol cans, which was of all the stupid things, to take this ozone depleting chemical and put it in a can where its only function is to be released into the atmosphere, that was a good idea to ban that. But the problem is, what do you use instead? And it turns out that one of the reasons why people use chlorofluorocarbons, aside from the fact that they compress very well and have great properties, is that they're not flammable. And nearly everything else that you can use instead is things like propane, or they're just flammable things. And as a result, aerosol cans are much more exciting now in connection with fire. And they do burn, and one should be careful about that. But not in this theater, because it's bad.
Sorry. We'll do a couple more questions. Here's one.
So I know you like to push the envelope when you do things. So do you have any stories you can relate to where maybe you did push the envelope a little far when you were making the videos?
We're too far? Or, I could interpret that question as, have I ever gotten hurt doing any of this stuff? And the answer is really not. Because, kind of the art of this is to get a video that looks really insane, but actually isn't, because you can't keep doing this. It's kind of like, you think of race car drivers that they really have a lot of protective equipment. They wear 5-point harnesses instead of just seat belts, because they do this every day and they have to be really careful, otherwise they won't be a race car driver for very long. And likewise, I really make an effort to not do anything that's actually dangerous, whether it looks dangerous or not. And usually this involves being far away. and having things at the end of a long rope or remote control or something like that. Because actually, to be perfectly honest, I am a total ninny, and I hate popping balloons because they scare me. And it's kind of about thorough preparation and doing it properly, and not actually being in danger. That's how you get to keep doing it.
So you talked about the strong sweetness of certain compounds. So could that be similar with bitterness or sourness? I know that's with citric acid. But
Well, you mentioned smell. So there certainly are molecules that have incredibly powerful smells. Some of which it's very important that they exist. So methyl mercaptan, or is it ethyl mercaptan? What is it that they put in natural gas? I think it's methyl mercaptan, where this sort of the concept of reporting a gas leak. You smell gas. Natural gas is completely odorless, but they put this compound in it, which is detectable by humans in fantastically low concentrations, and that's why people notice that there's a gas leak and report it. And then of course there's a whole world of different compounds whose purpose is sort of the reason you run into them is because of their smell. Perfumes. Another example is pee, animal pee, which it turns out you can buy on eBay, and lots and lots, like bobcat pee. You can buy that on eBay. Deer, boar. It's like I have a dozen or more of these things which we photographed, and they smell horrible. And I had to buy this like ammo case that you get at the Army surplus store, because it was coming out through the bottles and through the plastic bags and everything. It's now sealed, and I put it in a different room. But they're in the book. You can even buy skunk extract. And it comes with all kinds of warnings. It's like saying, if you open this, I have no responsibility, and you can't send it back. And it comes in a mason jar, like a canning jar, screwed tight, and then inside of that, it's packed in something. And as far as I got was just opening the outer jar, and then I immediately closed it. And what the photograph you see in the book is the jar, because I wasn't willing to go any farther in opening that substance. And that's actually a related chemical. I forget exactly what the one in skunk is, but it's similar to the methyl mercaptan that's in natural gas. As far as super intense sour and super intense bitter, that's a good question, actually. I don't know if there are things that trigger that. My guess is that there probably are, but nobody's really looked into it because there isn't much demand for that. Whereas making things sweet without calories is a big business.
So with that, I think we will say thank you to Theo Gray. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening. This podcast and Science on Tap events are created by VIA Productions. We have some great topics coming up at our events in the next couple of months, like the risks and realities of vaccines and astronomy and how stars are born. So if you'd like to find out more about how to attend one of our events, please check out viaproductions.org. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/scienceontap_ORWA, and that last bit stands for Oregon and Washington. We also have a fundraising campaign running through December 11th, 2014 that will help us cover production costs for this podcast and for our events. So if you've enjoyed this episode, we'd greatly appreciate your help. You can go to Indiegogo.com and search for Science Education for Adults, or go to our website, viaproductions.org, and click on the fundraiser link for more info. Anything helps. Thanks. As always, I'd like to say thank you to my volunteers, the Minions. They do so much behind the scenes, like taking tickets at the door and making sure the lights work and helping post things on the Facebook page. I really couldn't do this without them. The Minions are Scott Fry, Michelle Herman, Sam Lauk, Ashley Miller, Rita Nygren, Katie Parsons, Stephen Perry, Antje Spethman, and Chris Trone. Thank you so much for everything. Also, a final thank you to Jonathan Colton for letting us use his song Mandelbrot Set as our theme music.
You're a heart-shaped box of strings and wire in one badass fucking fractal, and you're just in time to save the day.